Empathy, we tried measuring empathy. It's like you can measure empathy like mad if you use one measure. But if you use 3, then all of a sudden your empathy measures don't correlate. So that really sucks. So the way out of that is just to use one measure, right? Well, obviously not. If your 3 empathy measures don't correlate, well, you got a problem. It's like you have 3 rulers, and you measure something and you get different numbers from each. It's like, really, that's probably, you're either measuring like bubble gum while it's stretching, or there's something wrong with your rulers. So, I don't think psychopathy exists. I think it's low agreeableness and low conscientiousness, because that would make you a predator, that's low agreeableness, and a parasite, because that's low conscientiousness. So that kind of sums up psychopaths. In terms of personality disorders, there was a bunch of them, and over the last 20 years, people have been, the psychometricians in particular, have been trying to cram those things into the big 5 structure, and they're reaching they're experiencing a tremendous amount of resistance from the established psychiatric community, and no wonder, but still the big 5 does seem to be able to provide a pretty good model of what constitutes personality pathology, and that's kind of surprising, because you may remember I told you when the personality measures were first originated, they threw out all the evaluative words, like evil, or bad, or good, for that matter. And, you could imagine that that would attenuate the relationship between personality and psychopathology, because you tend to use more more judgmental words when you're describing psychopathology, like antisocial, for example, which isn't in a personality questionnaire, but which, if it was, would likely load primarily on agreeableness, low. Positive illusions, told you about that already. Practical intelligence, it's like, no, that does not exist. And there's no evidence that it exists. So Sternberg, who has said that part of the reason he was interested in practical intelligence was because he didn't do very well on his GREs. So, he's got this idea that, well, there's a difference between book smarts, and that's sort of you nerdy people, and street smarts, which is like, I don't know, the punk who makes it out in the real world, something like that. And street smarts is like practical intelligence. But the problem is that he never really puts his practical intelligence measures, which really don't exist, up against IQ in a fair head-to-head fight. And he's been just slaughtered for this in the scientific press, especially by Linda Gottfredson, who wrote that paper that I had you guys read on, the complexity of everyday life. Gottfredson, she's a smart cookie, that woman, and she's brave too, because she follows the data where it goes, and she's a very, very clear thinker. She really gave Sternberg a couple of good whacks, and he certainly deserved it. Multiple intelligences, you've heard about that, I imagine. What are they? Sensory, motor, kinesthetic, emotional, I don't remember. What's that? Interpersonal, yeah. Those aren't intelligences. First of all, A, who knows if they exist, and B, we had a perfectly good word for them, which was talent. It's like you can't just take a word, like that's been studied for 100 years, like intelligence, which has a very, very specific definition, more specific than anything social scientists measure, right? So if you believe in social science at all, you have to take IQ into account. He just swipes the word, says, oh, well, everybody wins. It's like, yeah, people have talents. Fair enough, and they're not trivial. But to call them intelligences, and then he also says, when people harass him about his concepts, he says, well, I don't really believe in measurement. It's like, okay, that's fine, except if you're not going to believe in measurement, then what are you doing? It's not science. It might be, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's educational philosophy or something like that. But it's not science. And so it's 20 years later with his multiple intelligence theories, and there's been no published measures of them, and whenever people have tried to measure them and set them up head-to-head against, say, intelligence plus personality, intelligence and personality just eats them up. And so, multiple intelligence theory had a big effect on educational theory. It's like, well, every child should have the opportunity to develop their own particular form of intelligence. It's like, yeah, well, that's great, except you can't measure it. We don't know if it exists, and even if it does, you don't know how to develop it, and you haven't shown that you can develop it. And you haven't shown that you're not doing harm by, pretending that these things exist and act as if that's actual knowledge. So, things that might exist. Well, I told you about these already. Well, there's lots, I talked to you a lot about the big 5, but personality isn't that great a predictor of individual behavior, because people are very variable in their behavior from situation to situation. So the best you ever get out of a personality measure is about 0.3 or maybe about 0.4. That was discovered in 1968. There was a big hubbub about that made by Walter Mischel, who said, well, personality scales, they give you 0.2, 0.3, that's like 9% of the variance at best, so what about the other 90%, and why are we chasing such a trivial amount? And that killed personality research stone dead for till 1992. So for that's 24 years, I believe. Because everybody went, oh yeah, these are trivial effects, but then no one ever looked to see what the effects were in all the rest of psychology. Because it turned out that 0.2 and 0.3 is about on the upper end of the effects that you get in most forms of psychology, and so that even if it isn't that great, it's as good or better than whatever one else is doing. And so then there were also economic analysis, which I'll show you later, done in the 1990s that showed that because human variability in productivity is so great, especially on the Pareto distribution, that you don't need very accurate predictors for them to be extremely useful economically. Because the question might be, you know, like, so you're paying your employee $50,000 a year, and you could potentially pick an employee that was one standard deviation above the mean higher than average on conscientiousness. So with some bad measure, you know, so over 10 employees you'd get an average of one standard deviation higher, something like that. The real question is, well, what's the economic return on that? And the answer is, well, because people are so variable in their performance, when some people do, like, they're crazily productive, and others are like, they actually detract from the function of the organization, that they figure about 40% of managers add negative net value to the companies they work for. So it's like the productivity line doesn't end at zero. It's like, if you're a particularly bad manager, you can be sucking money out of the enterprise like mad. Well, it turns out that even small predictors have huge economic value. So even though they're not that good, the amount that they are good is better than interviews, for example, by quite a substantial margin. And so if you're going to hire people and you want better people, then you can use personality tests, and that actually works. So what's real? Well, cultural factors are real. The effects of your peer networks, that's real. The degree to which, like, one thing you guys should think about as you progress through life is that, you know, there's a variety of things that make you successful. Diligence is one, intelligence is another. Those are pretty rough. The breadth of your social network, that's a big deal too. And that's something to think about. You know, people talk about, I hate this word, schmoozing. It's a horrible word. And I wouldn't recommend that anyone ever does that, because that's sort of making connections for the sake of having them. But, you know, as you get older, you'll find that, of course, the people that you know get older too, and they get centralized in more and more, in positions with more and more influence. And so what that means is that one of the things that makes you valuable as you get older is how well connected you are in a sort of broad social network. Because a lot of what happens if someone comes to you and says, well, here, I've got a problem. I mean, one potential response to that is, well, I'll solve it. And another potential response is, well, I don't know how to solve that, but I know this guy or this woman, and they do know how to solve it. So, you know, that's an extremely useful additional attribute, and we haven't measured that. We haven't measured that much. I think it's one of the things that give older people an edge on younger people. Younger people are smarter in terms of fluid intelligence. They're not as conscientious, though, and their social networks are nowhere near as well developed. I put that slide together about a year ago. It's kind of an interesting one. I think you can see just from the facial expressions where these people sort of map, hey? Well, Jim Carrey, you could hardly get more extroverted than him. It's like he's on cocaine all the time. Mr. Rogers, he's agreeable. You wouldn't know the next guy. His name was Abe Vigoda. He played a very introverted policeman on an old sitcom. Woody Allen, well, he's neurotic as can be. Picasso, high in openness. Jimmy Stewart, very high in emotional stability. House, what's House's primary characteristic? Disagreeable. He's really disagreeable. He's very, very intelligent, right? But he's super disagreeable. So, but that's what makes him interesting. Robert Mitchum was the same. Then Clint Eastwood, disagreeable, introverted, and emotionally stable, right? So, It's quite interesting to see how varied the facial expressions are.